Hello and welcome to episode 2 of season 3 of our podcast. And today we are going to be talking about the German invasion of Norway, but not just Norway. It'd be a bit unfair not to mention Denmark because they get invaded as well. Mainly because it makes sense to invade Denmark. You can secure your northern borders, but also you can use Danish airfields and ports as jump off points for invading Norway. So at 4 a.m. on the 9th of April, the German ambassador to Denmark, Cecil von Renthe Fink, visits the Danish Foreign Ministry to speak to Peter Munch, the Danish Foreign Minister, and tells him that the Wehrmacht will be occupying the country to protect them from an Anglo-French invasion. He also demands that the Danish surrender and cooperate with the German invaders. Failure to comply would lead to the Luftwaffe bombing Copenhagen. Should really add to that in the 1920s, there was an Italian air theorist, Doe, who came up with this idea air forces could just dominate and destroy civilian areas and end wars, and you wouldn't need armies and navies anymore. And all the way through the 1930s, there is a belief that the bomber will always get through. They can destroy civilian centres and wipe out mass amounts of people. So this threat that the Luftwaffe will come over and destroy Copenhagen is pretty intense. The first German troops start landing in Gedser at 3:55 a.m. and they start to move north with paratroopers landing and taking Olberg Airfield and Sorstein Bridge, as well as the fort at Mesnede, which is the first ever recorded paratrooper drop. So we're adding an extra first to this. 4:20 a.m. the soldiers of the 308th Regiment land in Copenhagen and they bottle up the garrison in the citadel and then move to the Amaliaborg Palace to capture the royal family because they believe, if you take the royal family, the Danes will surrender. However, they hadn't really thought on the royal guard actually fighting back, which they do, and they managed to hold the Germans off for quite some time. King Christian X and his ministers meet to decide what to do, and they communicate with the Danish head of the military, General Pryor. Luftwaffe bombers do proceed to Copenhagen and drop leaflets. Kind of proves to the point that they can come and drop bombs if you can drop leaflets, but basically they're saying that you need to surrender. And at 5:20, the Luftwaffe attack the airfields at Verlios and neutralise half of the Danish air force in one air raid. King Christian fears for the safety of his people. They're going to be defenseless against a German air raid. He doesn't want to see mass death. And so at 6 a.m., he capitulates. The entire Danish war effort ends within 2 hours. It's just unfortunate. But we have two testimonies here. The first one by Hans Brun, which I'm going to come out with some personal bias and say it's one of my favourite testimonies in all the season, mainly because my son is reading it.
When the German aircraft came over in large numbers, we thought that when we reach noon, the English will come and help us. But 5 years went before this was a fact.
Yes, it's very short, but I do really like the whole "don't worry, the English will come and rescue us." Oh, we have to wait 5 years. And our second testimony is of Beatrice Brockenslag. She's a British citizen whose mother had married Danish aristocracy.
They came in from Germany into Rutland, and they also parachuted in. There was absolutely nothing to stop them. One moment we had the Danish flag flying, and the next we had the German flag flying. I couldn't believe it. Absolutely couldn't believe it. I know my mother was in the bath because it was early in the morning, and the farm manager came down and told us the Germans had walked in. And I went upstairs and said to my mother the Germans had walked in. And she said, "Don't talk rubbish, dear." That was all there was to it. But they had.
So that was a great testimony we just heard, and I just couldn't help but thinking that she's just going to have to scrub a bit more in the bath to get rid of all the rubbish. Anyway, I am stepping in for a moment to try and set the scene here just a little bit. We had just discussed Denmark, but now we're going to focus back in on the attack on Norway. So the German 21 Corps is going to be transferred to Norway via the sea, and they're going to split up into various targets. So in order to get the 21 Corps to Norway, the heavy cruiser Hipper and 4 destroyers are going to land 1,700 troops at Trondheim. Then you've got the light cruisers Köln and Königsberg that are going to lead a task force to Bergen, and that's going to include about 1,900 troops. Then you're going to have the light cruiser, the Karlsruhe, and it's going to lead a force to Kristiansand and Arendal with about 1,100 troops. You're going to have 4 minesweepers. They're going to land 150 troops in Egerson. And then you're going to have the main force with heavy cruisers, Blucher, the Lutzlow, and light cruiser Emden. And they're going to lead a large force of ships into Oslo specifically. And they're all going to be carrying about 2,000 troops total. And then you've got the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau. They're going to cover 10 destroyers. And of course, this is going to be at a distance, as the 10 destroyers land an additional 2,000 mountain troops to Narvik specifically.
But the landings don't really go quite to plan, especially not in Oslo, do they? Do they, Alina?
Yes, you've also given me the naval history for today. So, yeah, that's just me talking about boats. So, I'm talking about the loss of the Blucher. If anybody wants to come out for that pronunciation, come at me. So, on the 9th of April, so we're, starting to move a little bit forward with this invasion of Norway, at around 4:15 a.m., the German Naval Task Force is sneaking into Oslo Fjorden, and they pass the fortifications at Oskarberg, and the lead ship is exactly what I'm talking about, the Blucher. It's fired upon by the forts of 48-year-old 11-inch Krupp guns. She's hit with multiple shells and torpedoes. She basically set on fire and within 2 hours capsizes, and we're not quite sure, but between 600 to about 1,000 men perish with her. Then that's quite a lot of people. So the survivors, there's about 1,200 men, and they wade ashore and they're taken prisoner, but they are not interrogated. Right. So they assume that the Blucher has hit mines, and the other ships that are with her, they turn around and lead the rest of the force out and landed the rest of the troops for a land advance on the capital, basically onto Oslo. So they seize it later in the day, and Colonel Eriksson is forced to surrender his fortress on the morning of the 10th of April. The sinking of the Blucher gives the Norwegian royal family, Parliament, and the gold reserves basically time to flee the city and head for Harm, which they reach about a day later. And, this is kind of, we want to go back to, the invasion of Poland. They're also given time, so the government's given time to flee Poland. But these guys also have that time to be able to flee. And, it's not a lot of time. The Parliament, they're keen to wait for diplomatic solutions. Diplomatic solutions, not really going to happen, but they do put out to the mobilisation of the army by mail with the date that is set to report to the deposits on the 12th of April. They're a little bit...
It's kind of delayed that they're going to wait 2 days before the army are ready for action.
I don't want to make a bad comment about the Norwegian Parliament, but they just sound to be a little bit unprepared.
Yeah, the Germans land on the 9th. It's like, don't worry, we'll take 3 days to get everyone ready.
Anyway, let me just finish this off. So Hauptmann Spiller, the air attaché in Oslo, grabs a group of German paratroopers. They rush to try and capture the king, who's being moved. So when news comes of Spiller's attempt to basically try and capture the king, a force of 100 recruits and civilian volunteers are deployed, took them long enough, at a roadblock. And at about 1:30 a.m. on the 10th, a firefight began with Spiller's men. And after a 90-minute fight, the Germans are repulsed and Spiller is mortally wounded. So only takes 90 minutes, doesn't take very long. And it's pretty much an absolute, I don't want to use the swear word, but it's a mess. It's a complete and utter mess. Nobody's prepared. Nobody's ready. The Norwegian Parliament are just taking absolutely forever.
Yeah, and just on the sinking of the Blucher, if anyone goes to YouTube and Googles sinking of the Blucher, there's a lovely scene from the film The King's Choice, which is from the Norwegian. It's in Norwegian, but with subtitles, and it's of them sinking the ship. It's amazing. It's only a couple of minutes long, but it's really, really good.
She's also a war memorial, though, isn't she?
Yeah, because of the 600 to 1,000 men that went down on her. And she's a war grave, but there's a problem of her continually leaking oil into the Oslo fjord. The Norwegians have gone down and tried to drain as much of it as they can, without it as professionally as they can, but they couldn't get all of it. So yeah, she's still leaking pollutants. But she's I think her anchor's on display in Oslo.
Oh, that's interesting.
There's other landings and another ship that's worth mentioning, which is HMS Glowworm. So the task force that's heading to Trondheim encounters HMS Glowworm, which is a destroyer. She is meant to be part of the mine laying, and she's got herself detached and is trying to find her way around. And she spots a ship in the distance and sails towards it, thinking it's HMS Renown, the battle cruiser. Turns out it's the heavy cruiser Hipper, and the weather is absolutely appalling at this point. The visibility is really poor. When Glowworm realizes it's a German warship, they can't flee, so they decide, well, we'll attack her because there's nothing else we can do. Hipper, which massively outguns, she's huge in comparison to Glowworm. She's got much better guns, but it still takes her 4 salvos to hit Glowworm. Glowworm tries to launch torpedoes. That doesn't work. So Commander Roop comes up with this idea that the only way that he can stop this German Leviathan is that he's going to ram it. So he orders full steam, and this destroyer goes pelting towards Hipper at full speed and hits her, causes Hipper to take on 500 tons of water and tears a large chunk of armor off the side. But Glowworm is lost. One of the interesting facts before we get to the testimony is that Captain Helmut High of the Hipper writes to the British Admiralty in 1945 at the end of the war and recommends Commander Roop for a Victoria Cross. And he is the only Victoria Cross recipient to be recommended by the enemy. But we have a testimony of one of Glowworm's crew now, Albert Harris.
There were quite a lot of explosions. The ship was being hit, and after a time she started listing to starboard. After a time we were told to abandon ship. The Glowworm was well over on her side, so before I came up from the magazine I went to see if I could find my brother. He was in the after clam spaces near the magazine, but there was no answer. Down below there was all flooded, so of course I had to get out then. I came out on the upper deck, and that is when I saw the Hipper, massive ship, with a big swastika plastered on her floor deck. Flags flying, her guns still banging away. I crawled along the port side and got to a lifebelt locker. I threw one to one of the stoker POs, and a couple to the ratings. I put mine on. The ship was really over, so I walked down the side of the port side, and as she was going over I walked onto the bottom of the ship, and was in 2 minds as to whether to stay there or jump over. But anyway, I decided, and I jumped off the bottom. I swam away from the ship. The Germans were still pumping shells into her bottom, and there were men still sat on her. And then, all of a sudden, she started to disappear, and she went down, and I was still swimming about.
Following the sinking of Glowworm, the Hipper does go on with the rest of the task force. They get to Trondheim, and they open fire on the Norwegian shore batteries, which then cuts the power cables, which means that all their searchlights are now ineffective, and they aren't able to shoot at the destroyers and landing craft. And then the German army just march on in without any other problem.
It's interesting you mentioned the fact the searchlights being ineffective, not just there, but all over, because in Bergen you have the Königsberg and a training ship, the Bremsee. They're damaged, of course, by shore batteries defenses, but as you were mentioning before, these shore batteries have a lack of searchlights, which basically means that the German invasion force is able to get into the dock. It's able to then offload its troops surrounding and basically the defenses, and of course they would eventually surrender when the Luftwaffe would turn up, because you got to have superiority in the skies for things to cooperate. And then of course in Christiansand, right, you've got Task Force 4, which had to retreat twice, causing damage to the light cruiser, the Karlsruhe. Of course, in all of this that's happening, there's confusion that's caused when the defenders are being told by their central command that they are not, under any circumstances, to fire on British and French ships, whilst the Germans, gaining an advantage, would start using Norwegian codes. And of course, that's going to be problematic. And so in all of this confusion, and then of course with the support of the Luftwaffe, the Germans eventually are able to land all of their troops, and they're able to take the port by 11 in the morning. Of course, as was mentioned before, at the beginning, Chris was mentioning about the Stavanger, which is the first paratrooper landings ever. And they would eventually take and keep the airfield, which would allow an air bridge and, of course, the all-important Luftwaffe base to be able to accomplish their goals.
I don't really think we've been talking about the British much so far in this podcast, so I'm going to ask you an important question. Where is the Royal Navy?
I don't know, Alina. Can you tell me?
I can tell you exactly where the Royal Navy is. So, on the 7th of April, the German task forces number 1 and 2 had left the ports for the far north of Norway, but they're spotted at 9 a.m. and they're basically attacked by the RAF, right? By 1730, so for our American listeners, that's 5:30, Admiral Forbes is told that the Germans are at sea and he gets the fleet out. But by 2015, so 8:15, there's a problem. There's a bit of an error. So soldiers on board these ships that are ready for the R4 plan, they disembarked, and Forbes believes that the German fleet's trying to break out en masse into the Atlantic to destroy the convoys. So he deploys his ships and they try to cut them off in the North Sea rather than their actual route to the Norwegian ports. Basically, on the first day, the Germans have sailed without encountering much in the way of British vessels, and poor weather basically meant that the RAF, the recon aircraft, couldn't take off and find the Germans at the sea. So not a very good time for the Royal Navy, nor for the RAF. So the Germans pretty much have this sort of clear way into hitting Norway.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the British are all looking for them in the wrong place, and with the weather being so atrocious, they lose their air eye as well. So,
and they're basically what's the idiom that you use nowadays? They're going in blind, I guess, is the best way.
Yeah, the North Sea's a big place if you're looking for ships.
Well, considering if you listen to our Patreon, you would know our little joke about searching for boats and submarines in the North Sea. So head to our Patreon if you want to understand that joke a little bit more.
I have to say, Chris, you have done it again.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was possible.
Oh, stop it.
Okay, I won't. Also, if you want to know that joke, you really want to go to the Patreon and subscribe because you'll understand that great joke. And I think it's amazing. So good on you, Alina. But we've talked about Denmark. We've talked about Norway more broadly. And we just talked about the Royal Navy. But really haven't talked that much about Narvik, right?
Yeah. And we have landings there, don't we?
I mean, we do. And what's interesting is one of the things I always, especially when I'm teaching world history, it's always fun to talk about like names of conflicts because, you know, it's like the 30 Years' War. Was it really 30 years or not? Or the 7 Years' War. Was it really 7 years or not? So there's always context clues when you think of conflicts. And of course, the context clue here is the first Battle of Narvik, which I guess would mean there's more than one, but we'll get to that later. So the fjords off Narvik, April 9th. It's foggy. There's some heavy snow happening at the same time. And 10 German destroyers arrive. And Commodore Bondt's ships would capture 3 Norwegian torpedo boats. Now, 4 of these German warships, again, like everywhere else, would eventually land their troops. For them, it's on the north side of Herjingfjord, and it's to capture the Norwegian supply depot. Would you like to pronounce that for me, Chris?
Yeah.
What is this supply depot?
No.
Can I just say that I was about to say it's Chris's fault. He should have made everything phonetical. At least when we do Polish stuff, I know the pronunciation. So,
hey, you're the one that picked this, okay?
I will do for the future notes. I think it's Elfsfjordsmjön.
Yeah, so what he said. So then, of course, 2 more would land troops at the forts, which would turn out to be non-existent. Now, the Norwegian coastal defense ships, the Eidsvold and the Norge, they come to assist with their guns loaded, and of course, they signal to the Germans that they need to stop. As expected, that signal is ignored, and when that signal becomes ignored, the Norwegians would then fire a warning shot. At this point, the Germans would send over an officer to negotiate a parley. Now, he tried to convince them that they were friendly, but that the Norwegians had to hand over their ships, surrender, and the commander would also request time to consult with the Norwegians' commander, which the Germans would then refuse. However, the Eidvolt's wireless operator had been transmitting the conversation to the Norwegian captain Askim, and their reply is, "I'm opening fire." And so then Captain Willock tells the men, "Man the guns, we're going to fight, boys." So the German destroyer, the Wilhelm Heidkamp, positioned herself facing the side of Eidsvold with torpedoes at the ready. And as the Eisvold moves in, as they're firing at the Heidkamp, they also would then fire 4 torpedoes. Now, the Norwegian ship's magazines would ignite, and she's blown into 2 pieces. And by 4:37 a.m., she's gone, along with 175 of her crew, with only 8 people surviving. Now, the Norwegians would then open fire and encounter 2 destroyers in the dark at 4:45. Unfortunately for them, both salvos would miss due to the weather and complications that we mentioned at the beginning. Of course, their gun sights would have issues as well. Now, the Germans, they're going to have similar issues when firing their 5-inch guns or their machine guns. It's not just a Norwegian problem here. Now, the 3rd German salvo would strike these Norwegian ships and would sink in a minute. 90 crew are rescued, and 101 members of the crew would be completely lost. Now, that's what's happening kind of, in the fjords and on at sea. But on land, we have situations where the Norwegian garrison is going to wake up to the gunfire and explosions. But their commander, he's been considered to be by some pro-German, and he ordered a ceasefire. And, of course, a withdrawal completely from Narvik, as the German mountain troops would start to becoming ashore. Now, at the end of this conflict, the Germans would only have 1 oiler, the Jan Velum, and they could only refuel 2 ships at a time very slowly. Now, there was another one, the Kattegat. It was sunk by a British submarine, and there was a second, Skagerrak, and it would not arrive until April 14th.
Yeah, they're in quite a dicey situation because they've expended a lot of fuel to get to Narvik, and now they can't leave. And as you say, they can only refuel 2 at a time very, very slowly. So they've just got to hope that they're not attacked. Which, unfortunately, the second Battle of Narvik, which happens the next day, proves that that's not going to happen. Because the Royal Navy don't do things by halves. They like unrelenting force, and they also like almost cavalry charges of bravery and insanity. And this is what the second Battle of Narvik is, as a task force, the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla, under the command of Bernard Warburton Lee, who is the Commodore, leads a group of 5 destroyers in HMS Hardy, Hotspur, Havoc, Hunter, and Hostile. They approach early in the morning on the 10th of April, and they kind of catch the Germans with their trousers down in a way, because the Germans aren't really expecting an attack, and they're still resupplying. In fact, 2 ships, the Hans Ludemann and the Hermann Kuhne, are fueling from the Jan Velum at the time. At 4:30 a.m., the picket ship, the Dieter von Roeder, which should be watching the entrance to the fjord, has left its position to go and refuel. So there's no one watching when the British slip straight through that gap. Bonte's flagship, the Wilhelm Heidkamp, is sunk, along with the Anton Schmidt, and the Dieter von Roeder is heavily damaged. And we have the testimony of Cyril Cope, who's going to tell us his experience of the battle.
The captain must have decided not to fire any guns, just torpedoes. So the order came down to us on the forehead set of tubes. We were facing the right way to starboard, and we fired 4. We could see them going through the water. The first one went between 2 merchant ships, 2 iron ore ships which were stem to stern, and it went through the gap in between, and it went through this gap and hit the Wilhelm Heidkamp. Commodore Bonte was aboard that ship in his sea cabin. The majority of the crew and him were killed on that ship. Just blew up, and that was it. The second torpedo went the same way, and it hit the Anton Schmidt. The third one went through the gap and hit the Anton Schmidt. One of them hit the magazine and it just blew up. And as it blew up, the concussion and the shockwaves put out another German destroyer.
Well, that's quite gripping, but we've done the sea. We should turn to the German mountain troops because they don't just sit idly by during this confrontation, and they start opening fire on the British destroyers as best they can as well. And there's sort of a brief gun battle between the destroyers and the soldiers on the ground before the British decide to leave. They can't land. They haven't got any troops to land, and they don't want to bombard the civilians of Narvik because you're going to. It's not good for the Norwegian morale, and they're meant to be your allies. So they decide it's time to leave. HMS Hostile fires her torpedoes at the merchant ships that are at anchor, and by the end of the battle, 11 had been sunk, including 6 German, 1 British, 2 Swedish, and 2 Norwegian. With Bonte dying on the Wilhelm Heidecamp, command falls to Erich Bay, who is on the Wolfgang Zenker. Naval nerds, Erich Bay then goes on to is also the commanding admiral aboard the Scharnhorst when she sunk later in the war, but I'll leave that. The Erich Kolner and the Erich Geiser come out of Hjørjungsfjord, and Commander Bergen leads the Georg Thiel and the Bernd von Arnim out of Balingen Bay, and they try and catch the British into a pincer. And in this battle, HMS Hotspur is badly damaged by a torpedo strike. The Hunter was torpedoed and sunk, and the Hardy is set on fire and beached. Finally, as the British have retreated, the Georg Thiel is also damaged, but they can't do any more to stop what's left of the British force from escaping, and the battle's over. The Germans now have less ammunition, they have damaged ships, they have lost ships, and no way of escape. And you got to believe that if the British send this kind of force in on this day, when are they going to come back with that unrelenting force? Which is something to look forward to in our later episode. And our next episode will be out on the 13th of April, so do please come back for that. We will also be doing a special features episode for our Patreon, so if you fancy supporting the podcast, do sign up for that for extra bonus materials. I'll also be sorting out maps and things. And also, if you wouldn't, it would do us a great favor if you wouldn't mind rating us and leaving comments on your favorite podcasting streaming platforms. Any help helps the algorithm, which helps the news spread, and more people might come to listen and enjoy our podcast. But thanks again for listening. Thanks again for supporting us all. Thanks again for Alina and Zane for being dragged along with this. And thank you very much, and catch you next time.